The weekend camping trip was meant to be a break from city life. I needed fresh air, time to think, and most importantly, solitude. The campground I chose was deep in the Appalachian Mountains, well off the beaten path. When I arrived, the ranger mentioned I was the only one booked that weekend. That should have comforted me, but it didn't. The drive to the campsite was long and winding. Towering trees framed the narrow dirt road, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. I arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The campsite was tucked into a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. It was picturesque, yet oddly eerie. There were 4 camping spots in the clearing, each marked with a fire pit and a wooden picnic table. Mine was at the far end. What struck me immediately, though, was that one of the other spots had a tent already set up. The ranger said I was the only one here. I walked over to check it out. The tent was small, green, and looked like it had been there for a while. The fabric was weathered, and patches of dirt stained the sides. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. Peeking inside felt wrong, but curiosity won. I unzipped the flap slightly and shone my flashlight in. The tent was empty. No sleeping bag, no backpack, no gear. Just an old, tattered notebook lying in the middle. I stepped back, unsettled. Maybe someone had abandoned it. Still, it didn't make sense. Who leaves just a tent behind? I zipped it back up and returned to my site, trying to shake off the unease. As the night fell, I built a fire and cooked dinner. The quiet of the forest was both soothing and oppressive. Occasionally, I thought I heard faint rustling in the trees, but I told myself it was just animals. Around 10 p.m., I decided to turn in. As I zipped up my tent, I glanced toward the empty campsite. The tent was still there, illuminated faintly by the moonlight. I shivered and climbed into my sleeping bag, determined to forget about it. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was dead silent, too silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, just outside my tent. "Why are you here?" My blood ran cold. I held my breath, straining to listen. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave." I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking when I turned it on. The light reflected off the inside of my tent, casting strange shadows. I didn't dare unzip it. Instead, I shouted, "Who's there?" No response. Then, from the direction of the other campsite, I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper being pulled. My heart pounded as I imagined someone, or something, emerging from that old tent. I had to know, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. I slowly unzipped my tent and stepped out. The fire had died to embers, and the moon cast eerie shadows over the campsite. I turned toward the other tent. It was gone. The ground where it had been was bare, as if no one had ever camped there. My chest tightened, and I spun around, scanning the clearing. Then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading away from the empty site and into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The footprints were barefoot, oddly large, and sunk deep into the earth, as if whoever made them was unnaturally heavy. They led into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I walked for several minutes, flashlight trembling in my grip, until I reached a small clearing. In the center was a circle of stones, and within it, a pile of ash and charred wood. It looked like an old fire pit. Surrounding the circle were scraps of fabric, all torn and filthy. One piece was green, the same color as the missing tent. A soft rustling came from behind me. I spun around, and my flashlight caught a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, its features obscured by shadow, but its eyes glinted in the light, cold, reflective, and inhuman. "Leave," it whispered again, the voice resonating in my head like a distant echo. I didn't hesitate, dropping the flashlight. I bolted back the way I came. The forest seemed alive now, branches clawing at me as I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, heart pounding and lungs burning. I sped down the mountain road, not daring to look back. The next morning, I reported the incident to the ranger. He listened silently, his face pale. When I finished, he sighed and said, "That site's been closed for years. No one's supposed to camp there." I didn't ask why. I didn't want to know. Camping had always been my way of disconnecting from the noise of the world. The promise of isolation and silence in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains seemed like exactly what I needed. This trip was solo, just me, my tent, and the wilderness. The drive up was uneventful, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. The campground I chose was deep in the forest, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail. By the time I set up my tent and got a small fire going, dusk was settling in, painting the trees in deep oranges and purples. As the fire crackled, I felt the forest closing in. It was quieter than I expected. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I convinced myself it was wildlife after all. Being alone amplifies everything. Right. Dinner was simple. Just a can of beans warmed over the fire. I was settling into the stillness when I noticed something odd across from my campsite. Just beyond the reach of the firelight, the shadows seemed off. They moved, not with the flicker of the flames, but in a deliberate, almost rhythmic way. I squinted, trying to focus. The shapes were subtle, like the outline of someone standing just out of sight. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, the mind does weird things in isolation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. To calm myself, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trunks and branches. No movement, no shadows. I sighed, feeling a bit silly, and returned to my seat by the fire. As night deepened, the woods grew colder. I added more logs to the fire, watching the flames dance higher. That's when I heard it. A faint, deliberate crunching sound coming from behind me. I frowned. It wasn't the random sound of animals or falling branches. It was footsteps, slow, steady. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the eerie silence. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed my flashlight again, heart pounding, and turned toward the sound. The beam swept across the trees, but there was no one there. Still, the uneasy feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Deciding I'd had enough for the night, I retreated to my tent, zipping it tightly behind me. I lay in my sleeping bag, clutching a small knife I'd brought for emergencies. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Those same deliberate footsteps this time. They circled my tent. I held my breath, listening as they moved methodically, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. Whoever or whatever it was, they were making no attempt to be quiet. My flashlight lay just out of reach, and I didn't dare move to grab it. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Then, the tent fabric shifted. Something, or someone, was pressing their hand against it, tracing a slow, deliberate line along the side. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I couldn't stay in there any longer, gripping the knife. I unzipped the tent in one swift motion and burst out, shining my flashlight wildly. There was no one there. The campsite was eerily still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt. They were large, barefoot, and they circled my tent exactly as I had heard. I shone the flashlight around the clearing, following the trail of prints. They led into the forest, disappearing into the dense underbrush. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the prints for about 10 yards before they abruptly stopped. There were no signs of turning back, no scuffed dirt, just a dead end. It was as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. A sudden snap of a branch behind me made me whip around, knife in hand. The flashlight beam caught movement. Something darting between the trees, too fast to make out. My pulse was racing now. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over roots as I made my way back to the campsite. I didn't pack my things. I didn't care about the tent or the fire. I grabbed my car keys and bolted down the trail, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. When I reached my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The drive down the mountain was a blur. The next day, I reported the incident to the ranger station. The ranger listened, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "You're not the first to tell me something like this." "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat dry. There have been stories about that campsite for years. People hear things, see shadows. Some leave in the middle of the night, just like you. But when we go to check, we never find anything. I didn't ask any more questions. I haven't been camping since. Camping in the Adirondacks had always been on my bucket list. In the summer of 2019, my two closest friends, Mark and Alex, and I finally decided to make it happen. We picked a remote spot deep in the forest, miles away from civilization. No cell service, no other campers, just us and the wild. It sounded perfect. We arrived in the late afternoon, hiking 3 miles from the nearest road to reach our campsite. The clearing was serene, surrounded by tall pines with a small stream running nearby. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and by dusk, we were roasting marshmallows over a roaring fire. The forest around us was oddly quiet. No chirping crickets or distant animal calls, just silence. "Man, it's so peaceful here," Mark said, leaning back against a log. "Yeah," Alex replied, "but almost too peaceful. It's like the calm before the storm." We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, as the fire burned low, we started hearing faint whispers. At first, we thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like voices, though we couldn't make out any words. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark and Alex nodded, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. "Maybe someone's lost," Alex suggested. "Should we call out?" We hesitated, then Mark shouted, "Hello? Is someone out there?" The whisper stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. We shined our flashlights into the woods, but the beams illuminated only endless trees. There was no one there. "Let's just go to bed," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We doused the fire and retreated to our tents. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the fabric of my tent. My heart pounded as I lay crouching, listening. The sound moved slowly around the tent, then stopped. "Guys," I whispered, but there was no response from the other tent. Summoning all my courage, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the clearing. There was no sign of movement, but I could feel eyes on me. The sensation was so strong that it made my skin crawl. The next morning, I asked Mark and Alex if they had heard anything. Mark shrugged it off, blaming it on animals. Alex, though, admitted he had heard footsteps outside his tent, but had been too scared to look. That day, we decided to stick close to camp. We spent the morning fishing at the stream and the afternoon hiking a short trail nearby. As the sun began to set, we returned to camp, uneasy, but trying to enjoy the last night of our trip. We were sitting around the fire again, When we noticed it, someone, or something, was standing at the edge of the clearing. The figure was tall, shadowy, and utterly still. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice shaking. No response. Alex grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the figure. The beam revealed nothing but trees. The figure had vanished. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," I said, my voice firm. Mark and Alex didn't argue. That night, sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, whispers. But this time, they were close, too close. I Saturday up, clutching my flashlight, and that's when I saw it. A face, pale and expressionless, peering into my tent from the other side. I screamed, and the face disappeared. Mark and Alex baited out of their tent, panic in their eyes. "What happened?" Mark demanded. "There was someone watching me," I stammered. We didn't waste a second. Grabbing only our essentials, we packed up and hiked out under the cover of darkness. The trail felt endless, every shadow a potential threat. When we finally reached the car and sped away, none of us spoke. The silence hung heavy, each of us lost in our thoughts. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for strange happenings in the Adirondacks. What I found sent chills down my spine. Several campers had reported seeing a shadowy figure in the woods, always watching, but never approaching. Some said it was a hermit who lived in the forest. Others believed it was something far more sinister. I don't know what we saw that night, but one thing is certain, I'm never going back to those woods again.